Hello there, and welcome to Korga's Denizens. Pull up a chair, I'll fix you a drink, and let's talk about Star Citizen. Star Citizen's crowdfunding campaign started on their website on October 10th, 2012. I was one of the original backers. In fact, the only reason I didn't pledge on day one was because their servers had crashed due to high traffic. That's likely what prompted the Kickstarter campaign a week later. Their primary crowdfunding tool was a video in which they famously wrote the intro from the perspective of the PC Space Sim, which showed off high-fidelity graphics and space combat. Then, when Chris Roberts first appears in the cockpit of the Hornet to introduce himself, he says,
"Hi, I'm Chris Roberts. Ever since I saw Star Wars as a wide-eyed 8-year-old, I dreamt of being a hotshot pilot saving the galaxy or a lovable..."
Remember this, as it will come back later. You don't need me to tell you how the funding went, of course. They broke the Guinness Book of World Records for most crowdfunded project ever when they broke $39 million. They now have $660 million at the time of this recording. Clearly, there was an audience for this high-fidelity PC space sim, and those fans showed up in droves to support a game in a genre that they thought was dying. But this video isn't a history of Star Citizen. I might do that in a different one, but this one is more focused on something fans will know is very divisive: the flight model, and more specifically, why Master Modes is splitting the community. Before we get into the details, I want to talk about expectations, and for once in a Star Citizen video, I'm not talking about ones set by the developers. No, these were set by your imagination every time you watched a space movie or show. I want to talk about the cognitive dissonance of space combat in real life versus media. Think back to the first science fiction space battle you ever saw. Maybe it was Star Trek, which most commonly mimics submarine-style warfare with their massive ships and slow-paced maneuvering. Phasers are instantaneous beams of photons acting like real-world laser beams. Maybe it was Battlestar Galactica, where they use ballistics that take time to travel from you to your target, and pilots pull turns at Gs that would pulverize someone from our world. But I think that far and away the most common image we have for science fiction space combat is Star Wars. When George Lucas was making Star Wars, he said this about their space combat.
Fairly early on that the idea of a space dogfight came into play, of wouldn't it be interesting to take that kind of visual excitement and put it into outer space. And then I took footage from actual dogfights that we got out of gun cameras in World War I or II, and out of that created a sequence that is more visual in motion.
World War II-style atmospheric dogfighting was always meant to be the result. In fact, World War II film The Dam Busters is clearly a direct reference for the film's shot list. Back in those days, there wasn't nearly the same degree of knowledge about how space combat might actually look, and anyway, it didn't matter. Star Wars is what we'd call science fantasy nowadays, with magic and rules that defy the physics of our reality. But nobody cared about that because it was electric and exhilarating to watch. So what does that matter? Well, because most of us had contact with sci-fi movies and TV before we got to games, so that's how our expectations were set. Even subconsciously, we expect space combat to look and feel a certain way. Now, if we apply a little critical thinking as adults or just smart kids, we can see that this is of course not at all how it would work. Neil deGrasse Tyson described realistic space combat as likely taking place at great distances, far greater than your eyes would ever see. This is fundamentally the opposite of what most of us expect from a space game, realistic or not. Beyond that, space has no friction, and therefore flight works very differently. Changing course requires massive amounts of opposite thrust, and if you want to zip around like in Battlestar or Star Wars, you'll be pulling Gs that would pulverize us puny humans. If you were to fly like that in the real world, you'd be skating wildly through the void, barely able to turn your ship around, much less dogfight like an F-35 in atmosphere. This is where jousting occurs in space games with Newtonian physics. Average pilots lose control of their ships because they expect the agility and friction of atmospheric combat, like Star Wars. It's a lot harder to get this result when you use Newtonian physics, instead of arcade-style combat like most games go for. Rogue Squadron or the more recent Star Wars squadrons are great examples of that. So what's the obsession with realism about? Well, the simulation game genre has existed since the 70s, so clearly people have a long-standing desire to immerse themselves in a world that is so granular and systemic that it feels real. The rules of this world are as close to the rules of our real world as they can be, hence the simulation moniker. They simulate an aspect of our world. But simulating reality is not the only way to achieve immersion, and sometimes gamers mistake immersion for following the unbreakable rules of physics. I think this can be taken all the way back to a basic design philosophy in all of gaming. Just because it's real doesn't mean it's fun. The point of many immersive games is to balance what is believable with what is fun. In this way, we can use our imaginations to suspend disbelief, because what we're seeing is plausible, realistic enough to believe, and we can engage with the game's mechanics, which are, by their nature, an unrealistic artifice designed to be fun at the expense of some realism. If the balance is properly struck, you can feel immersed in the experience of the game while still having lots of fun due to a well-designed system of mechanics. Take the granddaddy of all game mechanics, hit points. Hit points are famously a completely unrealistic and fake way to represent character health in games. This is because the concept of hit points dates all the way back to tabletop war games, where hit points were a way to measure a ship's integrity before it would start to sink. Doesn't really apply to people though, does it? But that's fine. Hit points make games like Doom and Dungeons & Dragons, which originated the hit point system as we know it, fun. They are an unrealistic game mechanic that make it easy to have fun and are believable enough that most people aren't going to question it while they're playing. This is what I call plausible realism, and it's clearly very different from true realism. Imagine you're playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and every time you get shot, you have to field dress the wound and then get to a medical facility before you bleed out. It would stop the game in its tracks, regardless of how realistic it is. Even more realistic games like Arma have a med kit that magically makes you better, because that lets you keep playing the part of the game that you signed up for. In video game design, the more realistic you get, the more simulations you have that operate your game for you. But from a game design perspective, this means unpredictability and chaos, as simulations can't be precisely controlled outside of, is it realistic or not? Unless you introduce game mechanics to guide the player experience. Game mechanics are inherently artificial. They break the simulation and the realism in order to give the designers some control over the gameplay experience. This is a good thing, as game designers exist because they know how to make games fun. This is an example of perceived reality versus actual reality, gamified mechanics that feel real enough versus true simulation that comes at the cost of a more guided, accessible gameplay experience. My point is there's an internal push-pull struggle between realism and accessibility, and the tether at the center of this tug-of-war is the game designer trying to keep all things balanced and, most importantly, fun. The people pulling at each end? They're the different kinds of players, each wanting fundamentally opposite things from their games. True simulation versus easy-to-grasp game mechanics. Here's why all of this is important. CIG and Chris Roberts pitched Star Citizen to fans of the PC space sim niche. It sounds like a joke now, but back then it very much was a niche. How many of your gaming friends had played EVE Online or Evacron Mercenary before 2012? Popularity in the genre had been slipping since the late 90s, and, as a crowdfunding video points out, nobody was investing in it in the AAA space. Certainly not for PCs. The following is the language used to pitch the game's flight system on day one, what the OG backers signed up for. Real physics, but fun to fly. Full rigid body simulation of all spaceships. You wanted proper Newtonian physics? You got it. Spaceships adjust their trajectory and orientation just like the real thing. Like a modern-day F-35, the ships have fly-by-wire systems which take the player's inputs and then translate them into the commands for the ship's engine and thrusters to articulate and deliver the required thrust to achieve the pilot's request. Holy moly, that was a mouthful. So I think this is fascinating because we can already see the beginnings of the conflict between what's realistic and what Chris and CIG wanted to do as game designers. Calling out Newtonian physics and then using an F-35 fighter to illustrate the fly-by-wire system feels like the fundraising pitch version of a Freudian slip. So why would there be tension between these two ideas already? I think language is important. What we say evokes ideas, emotions, and responses in other people. In this case, I think Chris Roberts' language has gotten in the way of what he actually wanted to convey. Starting decades ago and hitting perhaps a high in the 80s and 90s, true simulation games are what they sound like. Games whose rules are defined by simulating as realistically as possible real-world activities. Then there are simulation-style games, which are meant to evoke realism, but are willing to sacrifice the true simulation in order to create a more tailored and accessible gaming experience. This is what Roberts has done his entire career, and I think this is what he intended for Star Citizen and Squadron 42. Chris Roberts and I share a lot when it comes to science fiction fandom. For both of us, and obviously many millions more, Star Wars was the foundational experience and the gold standard for fun science fiction. I'll reiterate here that Star Wars really is science fantasy, and then I have to stop because I can't keep correcting myself every time it comes up. So anyway, In a 1995 issue of Australian magazine Hyper, the writer sets up the experience of playing the original Wing Commander before interviewing Chris Roberts. Wing Commander, when it was released in 1989, was an unprecedented explosion of graphics, sound, and action. It was Wing Commander that first gave us the term interactive movie. This is what people expected with a Chris Roberts game. This, I believe, is always what people should expect with a Chris Roberts game. You can track common themes in his games all the way back, decades before Star Citizen and Squadron 42, fast-paced dogfighting, space opera cinematic storytelling, and high-fidelity graphics that push hardware to its limits. Any of this sound familiar? I think this one quote says it all, however. The interviewer asks Chris about the team's one-off attempt at making an atmospheric flight combat game called Strike Commander. Chris's reply? It was fun, but it took such an extra amount of time because we were simulating a real jet fighter. The battle cry at the end of the project was, "Reality sucks." With Wing Commander, you just basically worry about what's fun. You don't worry about what's realistic. To be very clear, I am not condemning Chris or CIG whatsoever. I want to paint an accurate picture of who he is as a sci-fi fan and game developer before we get to Star Citizen. This is the guy we all invested in, and one of my points is that if you invest your money in something you didn't properly research, then prepare to be surprised along the way. And by the way, I didn't do that either. I just pledged because I thought it sounded cool, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I just happened to be aligned with what CIG has been doing and what they're intending to do in the future with the games. I, for one, am very happy with my investment in these games. I always have been, even though I've long lamented the slow development. In the Wing Commander series, the flight system was based on getting on the tail of your opponent using boost to get into position. It was as much like World War II dogfighting in space as they could make it in 1989. In fact, most of Chris Roberts' games use a more arcade-style flight system to closely mimic the feeling of being a pilot in Star Wars. If you've ever played Freelancer, you'll see what I mean. This isn't realistic at all, but judging by their massive success and fans, it was fun. Wing Commander games were always described as space sims, even though we can now look at them with many more space simulation games to compare and see that they were arcade-style space games. The word sim in this case is a bit of a misnomer. Just because your game runs computational simulations doesn't make it a reality simulator. I think a classic example of a true sim is Microsoft Flight Simulator, which famously recreates in excruciating detail every aspect of airplane flight at a one-to-one level. When we hear the word sim, this is what modern gamers think about, and learning how to fly planes in that game requires actual research. There is a sky-high learning curve and skill ceiling. I think the reason we've gotten so much angst and frustration over the ever-changing flight model, the oldest system in the game, is because what was originally promised, the Newtonian physics-style combat, is a double-edged sword. With the help of John Pritchett's IFCS, it can result in wonderful dogfighting and close-quarters combat, but with a mediocre pilot, it can easily slip into jousting, overcompensation, and out-of-control long-range combat. This isn't cinematic, and most would agree it's not fun either. Without a perfectly tuned system, Newtonian physics lead to frustrating and unfun combat. Just refer back to Frontier Elite 2's physics update after the original's arcade-style flight. My guess is that this is what Chris fundamentally dislikes in a space game. Personally, I tend to agree, at least depending on how far you take it. And this is the crux of the issue. What space sim gamers think is fun tends to be the opposite of what science fantasy fans imagine and enjoy. And like it or not, there are way more Star Wars-style science fantasy fans than there are hard sci-fi space sim fans, at least in gaming. And Star Citizen is trying to be everything for both, though I doubt for much longer. Let me start this one off with somebody who did it better. The Noobifier 1337 has a fantastic video about the history of Star Citizen's flight model up to October 2019, from version 1 to version 3.2. In defense of simulation fans, I want to highlight a couple points that the Noobifier makes. When you have simulation-based gameplay, you get slight variances in handling from things like the amount of fuel you're carrying, whether or not your loadout includes heavy missiles, and even whether you have extra passengers or not. There are subtleties to simulation that create incredibly rich, deep, and complex gameplay. This is why there are sim fans to begin with, because they are obsessed with that type of sim, and therefore can invest tons of time learning the systems and becoming really good at manipulating them. This is a skill ceiling, and simulations often have the highest skill ceilings as a result of their complexity. He also describes the original Arena Commander and ships as quick, which may sound counterintuitive to some who haven't played those original versions. If the game had Newtonian physics, how did the combat feel so engaging? This is where fly-by-wire and IFCS comes in. If any of you have played Elite Dangerous, you'll be familiar with this. The games essentially interpret your choices, and the ship helps you achieve what you want with more finesse than the expected ice skating through space. You get an agile and quick response as a result, what the Noobifier describes as knife fighting, the idea that space combat is close, reactive, and rewards high-skill players. There were maneuvers to neutralize circle strafing, and jousting wasn't a thing because targeting couldn't be done at such ranges, at least not with small fighters, which is all we had back then. So how do you balance that kind of intense maneuverability? With G-forces. And this is where simulation and reality diverge drastically, even on the crunchier Elite Dangerous side. Simply put, if you tried to pull the kinds of moves that we want to see in space games, you would be turned into bone-crunching mush in real life. Games use G-forces to approximate a real-world effect without being too realistic and punishing. It limits players and creates that fine line between viable and risky maneuvers. Here we got our first game mechanic that differentiated realism and fun. I think 2014-era Arena Commander worked because it was likely designed for Squadron 42, which focuses exclusively on fighters and dogfighting. But Star Citizen has larger ships, and once you start balancing those extra characteristics, the flight model breaks down. I think this is probably the earliest example we have of the two games clashing with each other and slowing down the overall development. So how can CIG fix this when they have to keep the flight models the same between games? After all, Squadron 42 was always intended to prepare players for Star Citizen. They fix it the only way they can. Compromise, the result of the biggest growing pain the game will likely ever have. Compromise is largely what we've experienced with the PU flight model, and I don't think it's controversial to say that for most people, it sucks. Most people, except for the light fighter aces. Probably the primary complaint people have about Master Modes is that it dumbs down space combat such that ace pilots now have a non-zero chance to be taken out by a newbie. This feels like a big problem for those pilots, as Star Citizen is meant to be a skill-based game, and they have put a lot of work into becoming highly skilled at the game. So why would you punish the people who are dedicating hundreds of hours to be the best? For two reasons: accessibility and game design. Let's tackle the first one first, as it's the easiest to get through. In simple terms, Star Citizen has a far larger audience than just hardcore space combat pilots, and the developers have decided that this aspect of the game should be viable for everyone, not just the elite. Think about it this way: how many normal people are able to practice for hundreds of hours to perfect one game system? I mean, hell, how many people play any game for hundreds of hours? Far and away, the majority of players will hop in for a couple hours over a weekend and want to have fun. These players, in the current system, actively avoid PvP because it's senseless. The only people playing PvP are the ace pilots looking for easy targets. So why would you ever do it? Like it or not, Star Citizen has mass appeal, and the developers have to adjust to make the game easier to be decent at. Now, the flip side is that you have your most dedicated fans, the people who have put in so much time to learn your game, and you're burning them by taking away what they've mastered in favor of a seemingly simpler combat system. That's a tough pill to swallow, and while not every dedicated Star Citizen fan is an ace pilot, those people definitely qualify as superfans, and it sucks that they're losing what they've put into the game. That said, and I know this is a tired defense of the game, but it is an alpha. We click an acknowledgement agreement every time we play the game. Every single aspect is subject to change whether we like it or not. Of course, the developers would hope that we like it, but when the community becomes divided, it makes sense for the developers to favor the majority. That way, they can make the game fun for as many people as possible. I did some research and I thought it was interesting the different ways people express their opinions about Master Modes. There are some very vocal people against it, and yet from what I could tell, the vast majority of players are in favor of it. Even with caveats like more balancing being needed, people are generally in favor of it from what I can tell. And this brings me to the second reason CIG are changing the flight model. Master Modes is foundational to their game design. YouTuber Buzzcut Psycho made a great video breaking down why Master Modes is so divisive, but also why ace pilots in particular are against it. In short, ace pilots are typically the lone wolves, wanting to take on impossible odds to show their skill and blow others out of the sky in light fighters. This works currently because speed, acceleration, and agility are by far the most valuable characteristics in the PU flight model. They can retreat from a fight when their shields go down, lure enemies away from the pack to take them out 1v1, and then repeat with the rest. The SCM speed cap with Master Modes completely erases this style of play. The major complaint is that with this change, the skill ceiling comes crashing down and makes solo fighters taking on a dozen pilots far more risky, maybe even impossible. But this is the point. I don't think anyone can reasonably argue that the light fighter meta is good for the game. CIG agrees and has expressed this many times. So now, when a light fighter takes on 3 people in PvP, there is a far greater chance they'll go down in flames. This is the point. From day one, CIG has expressed the importance of multiplayer co-op in Star Citizen. It's literally in their description of the game from the original crowdfunding pitch. And as Buzzcut Psycho points out, Master Modes intentionally and effectively trades the solo light fighter dominance for team play and coordination amongst a squadron. This game was always meant to be played with friends, so if you want to take on a Corsair and a light fighter, you'd better have backup. In the current PU model, the size of the battlefield is comparatively massive, tens of thousands of kilometers. This is because there's an incredibly high speed cap, and therefore people can be dragged all over the place by faster ships. But when you cap speed, you bring combat way closer together. This gets back to more knife fight style combat, and more importantly, it keeps wingmates close together. You can actually react to what's happening to your friend when you hear, "He's on my tail!" and you're close enough to both see it and also have an impact. You can fly over and rescue your friend, rather than watching helplessly from 10,000 kilometers away. A comment I found on Reddit by user Kcheck says it best. I really think folks miss the whole point of Master Modes. That's to slow down ship combat so that other gameplay mechanics can come into play. Boarding actions, ECM, fire control, gunnery, and repair. These and other gameplay mechanics are all destined to be part of the space combat simulation they're creating. This hits the nail on the head and is a reminder that yes, this is still an alpha. There is a lot coming down the pike that we don't have yet, but the game systems need to account for. Space combat needs to slow down in order for these other systems to be engaged with. If you die in a matter of seconds in an otherwise even fight, your engineer has no opportunity to fix the shield generator that went down. This all feeds back to the idea that Star Citizen is designed to be a co-op experience. If you want to solo, you can do that too, but you still need AI blades to do the things a friend would otherwise be doing. And just to put a bow on the earlier discussion about reality versus arcade gameplay, Reddit user HadronFlux said it well. Real physics arguments are spurious as the human body can't survive the G-forces players want. Managing velocity becomes a nightmare as you drift into obstacles and make large sweeping turns, or just joust. Like it or not, space combat is currently way too fast for the kind of game CIG want to make. CIG know what they're doing, and they know it because they have run the full gamut of mistakes up to this point. Old school backers will quickly remind you of previous metas, like the overpowered Super Hornets, Omni-Sledge dominance, and high agility ships being nerfed one after the next. Most people are either neutral or dislike the current flight model. CIG agree, and I think they are intentionally reverting closer to what it used to feel like, back in the days that the Nubifier refers to. It's not the same, and it doesn't achieve its goals in the same way, but it is definitely heading that direction compared to the PU model we've had for so many years. I should say that for my money, the current version of Master Modes is as arcadey as Star Citizen should ever be, and I think there's room to make it a little less so. Games like Starfield and Star Wars Squadrons have very arcadey combat, and I found them pretty boring almost immediately. Besides that, there's plenty of options for fully arcade-style space combat. I want something with more meat on its bones. Just don't make me play Elite Dangerous. I don't have the time to watch hours of YouTube tutorials just to wrap my head around controlling my ship, and I know CIG are aware of that preventative kind of learning curve too. CIG have been trying to please all their fans at once, and that's an impossible task. But we've demanded it, as fans who all want slightly different things from them. They are trying to walk the line between sim and arcade, and in the process have made pretty much everyone unhappy with the current flight model. This is why Master Modes exists. So what's the point of all this? Well, I think it's straightforward, and maybe elegant. This game has always been in open development, and CIG listened to us. I want them to acknowledge the players who play their game the most, even if they don't ultimately change their development to suit them. And I'm glad they're aware that the game could stand to be more accessible and fun to average players too. This development is a conversation that's been going on for over a decade, and as long as they hear us, and we continue to give our time to a buggy, sometimes unplayable alpha, we will ultimately land on a special, beautiful, fantastically fun version 1.0. This video was heavily researched, and a few of the sources were made by fellow creators. Thank you to those and to the broader community for sharing their thoughts on Master Modes. Keep the conversation going in the comments. I am by no means the final authority on this, and I'm curious what I've missed and what your opinions are. Give me a like if you think I've earned it. I'll be making more content like this. Everything sci-fi, games, and movies that you can think of is what I'm interested in, and it's what I'm about. So if that's your jam, then consider subscribing. Now, finish your drinks, slip me some coppers, and I'll see you again next time.